This past summer, I awoke from one of the worst panic attacks of my life. I thought I was suffocating. No, I thought I was actually dying. Through our baby monitor, I could hear my daughter starting to move in her crib, and I needed to get to her before she woke up and realized that I wasn't there. Room spinning, heart pounding so hard I could hear it, I bolted out of bed, dashed down the hall, and accidentally knocked my body hard against the bedroom wall. Holding my bruised ribs, I found her peacefully asleep. I, on the other hand, was a complete mess and began to sob convulsively. I needed to sleep. But when I returned to bed, I just stared and stared at the monitor. And several hours later, drifting off, I dreamt that I was standing above her crib, still watching her sleep. That was the first night we put our daughter to bed in her own room, in her crib, and I was racked with guilt. I feared that she would wake up in the middle of the night in existential terror, feeling alone and deserted, not knowing where I was. Turns out, I have abandonment issues. Let me share something else. I'm a marriage and family therapist. It was my dream to become a mother. But almost immediately after I gave birth, I began to grapple with crippling anxiety and depression. Although I was juggling a career and presenting as sane, in my private life, the mere act of giving my daughter a bath could leave me paralyzed and panicked. I was plagued with intrusive thoughts. Images flooded my mind of possible accidents and ways that my daughter could be harmed. Accidents at the level of Final Destination death scenes. Like the fear of my husband's burning coffee spilling on my daughter's face, or knives falling from unforeseen places. I was experiencing extreme brain fog and battling feelings of hopelessness. The sounds of my daughter's cries could set me into such an alarm that I'd become physically ill. My symptoms were unceasing. I felt compelled to constantly be around my daughter in order to protect her, but I also wanted to run out the door because I couldn't deal with the ramifications of any of her care. I was suffering. So, as a marriage and family therapist, I thought, oh, this is postpartum depression. I've studied this. But some of my symptoms went way beyond the scope of PPD, and I needed to get to the bottom of what was really going on, because this diagnosis wasn't fully representative of what I was experiencing. It wasn't lining up. And if it wasn't lining up for me, could it mean that it wasn't lining up for others? So I did what any self-respecting person does, and I Googled it. And in searching my symptoms, I came across diagnosis after diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, otherwise known as PTSD. I had found my answer, but how could that be? Many of us are familiar with the term PTSD when applied to war veterans or to people who have been the victims of a sexual assault. But just how does it apply to becoming a parent? I didn't give birth in a minefield, but based on my symptoms, I knew this diagnosis was accurate for me, that somehow my becoming a parent had triggered PTSD symptoms. In reading accounts of other men and women who were experiencing PTSD symptoms from becoming parents, I understood that I was not alone and that my suffering was in fact caused from parenting with unresolved childhood trauma. PTSD symptoms are caused by triggers, and my trigger was my daughter. It's not a diagnosis taught in school, and it's not currently recognized by the DSM, but countless people are dealing with the results of post-traumatic stress disorder triggered from parenting, or PTSD, parental post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, postpartum depression is a very real thing, and thankfully, the medical field screens for it. But this is about the fact that there are countless men and women who are experiencing a surge of PTSD symptoms from becoming parents that's stemming from their own childhood trauma. And these symptoms are mimicking postpartum depression and anxiety, and they're not getting screened, correctly diagnosed, or properly treated. And I really want to highlight that this is also a men's issue. Men are having deep emotional responses to becoming parents, and they're unable to put it into words. They're more prone to express parental PTSD as anger, aggressiveness, irritability, or to simply distance themselves emotionally and sometimes physically from their children in order to avoid these triggering interactions. So, how is this happening? Now, I'm not a neuroscientist here, so I'm going to really oversimplify this. But based on our understanding of the brain, when you experience a traumatic event, you are often in a state of hyperarousal. And because of this, the brain isn't always able to properly process the memory, and it gets stored in its state-specific form. So within the amygdala, it saves the sights, the sounds, and the smells associated with the event. So if you can imagine that these memories are not properly integrated, but more like open tabs on a computer. So when you have a present experience that matches stimuli from a past traumatic event, those tabs get triggered and opened up. My daughter was holding the mouse to my computer, and while crawling through our home, she was just innocently clicking away at these tabs. Her mere existence triggered memories from my own childhood trauma. Now, although not all trauma leads to PTSD, PTSD is caused by trauma. So if you experience child abuse, those traumatic experiences, whether physical, emotional, or sexual, can become stimuli triggered by interactions with your child when you become a parent. So, for all the adults sitting in this room, statistics tells me that 1 in 4 of you would report having been physically abused. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 20 men would admit to having been sexually abused. And these statistics just covers those of you that would disclose the abuse. And though physical and sexual abuse gets most acknowledged, it's often physical, emotional, medical, and educational neglect that's actually the most common form of child abuse and accounts for up to 75% of reported cases. Neglect is just as likely to open a tab as any other form of abuse. Some of you have experienced childhood events that you wouldn't even characterize as traumatic, but they're affecting you as adults today. There's a famous story of a man who came to therapy because he wanted help getting treated for processing his experiences when he was a young boy in the Holocaust. The problem was, he never experienced the Holocaust. He was too young. Through treatment, it was discovered that when he was little, his grandfather shared a room with him. Now, his grandfather had lived through the Holocaust and would share stories with his grandson about his experience. The little boy was so greatly affected that when he grew up, he believed it happened to him and he needed treatment for the trauma. This story is told within the mental health field to illustrate that it doesn't matter if others believe you were abused. It doesn't even actually matter if you believe you were abused. All that matters is how your brain has stored the information. So how might these symptoms show up? Survivors of sexual abuse might experience being triggered from giving their child a bath or changing their diaper. They may experience extreme fear around leaving their child with a babysitter, even if that sitter is a close family member. And even more often overlooked is that the trigger might not occur until the child is older and at the age the parent was when they experienced the abuse. Survivors of physical abuse might experience an immense amount of anxiety around the physical health and well-being of their child. Survivors of emotional abuse might experience an overreaction to their child possibly feeling rejected, neglected, or abandoned. But these triggers don't always correlate as directly as those examples. any stimuli that the brain encounters and associates with the point in life that the past trauma occurred has the potential to open a tab. For example, a character in a children's book. The smell of your child's shampoo, the texture of your baby's blanket, any of these can cause a parent to experience PTSD symptoms. We know that child abuse can lead to PTSD, and we also know that many of these abused children grow up and become parents themselves. These parents then become the walking wounded. They have children, and these open tabs are ceaselessly clicked on and firing off. Just recently, Governor Newsom appointed the first ever Surgeon General of California, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. Yes. One of the first things that Dr. Harris did was to announce that all children should be screened for childhood trauma. And that is amazing. But we have to go one step further. We could and should make screening available to prospective parents so that 5 years from now, an evaluation for undiagnosed trauma is as common for parents as a recommendation for a birthing class or a breastfeeding specialist. Imagine a world where people are encouraged and supported in their efforts to break the cycle of generational trauma by addressing childhood traumas before becoming parents. And imagine making effective treatment available to those triggered parents. I'm happy to report that I received the treatment that I needed, and that my daughter and I are sleeping soundly in our own rooms throughout the night. At bedtime, I sing her "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." I tell her that I love her and that I will see her in the morning. And when she tells me, "Good night, Mama," I know that she actually will have a good night, and so will I. And most importantly, that my childhood traumas are not going to be hers. I was suffering, and there are so many more out there who are suffering too. But we have an opportunity to help people heal, and in so doing, help create healthier future generations. Thank you.